Hello, I
Hello,
understand.
Mario. Long time no see.
No time no see. I think Ernie's running a few minutes late.
Okay, he's
Surprise,
entitled.
surprise.
He's entitled. When you say a few minutes, how many minutes are we
No,
talking?
no, no, no. I don't know. One of the guys is at his house waiting. And he said the whole house is dark. So
Uh-huh.
he called him and says they were on the way. They were a little late.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Hi, Ernie. I think Saul was outside your house.
Yeah,
Saul,
still outside.
Saul is inside.
Okay. All right.
Hi, Mario.
Hi, Saul. Page 32.
Yep.
Pouring from
Right, we're
the
dealing with the Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni and all of that issue. Right.
Mhm.
So pouring from a Kli Rishon. So far, here's Walter. Okay. So far, we have seen, we're starting on page 32, Walter. So far, we have seen that one is not allowed to cook raw food in a hot Kli Rishon, even when the Kli Rishon was removed from the fire. Certainly, a Kli on the fire is a Kli Rishon, but that Kli remains a Kli Rishon. We also saw that according to many Achronim, one may also not place uncooked food on top of solid food in a Kli Sheni. What is the halacha with respect to irui, pouring from a Kli Rishon onto uncooked food? Although this question is not directly addressed in the Talmud Bavli, the Amoraim and the Yerushalmi do debate whether pouring hot liquid from a Kli Rishon over uncooked food constitutes bishul that is forbidden on Shabbos. In this case, there are no hot walls to assist cooking, right? In a Kli, not only do you have the hot food within the Kli, but you have the walls that are hot, that are going to continue add heat. Now, when you're pouring something, yeah, that which is poured is hot, but there's no walls, right? At the point of contact, the hot liquid has not yet started to cool through contact with the cold walls of a Kli Sheni, right? When you pour it into an empty dish, so now the Kli Sheni, with an empty Kli Sheni, has the ability to cool some of the heat from the food or the liquid that was poured from the Kli Rishon. But the argument, the Tzurba is arguing that pouring it directly on food might cook it. Rabbeinu Yonah states, Rabbeinu Yonah is a Rishon, that pouring from a Kli Rishon is capable of cooking, just like immersing food in a Kli Rishon. Although Rabbi Yossi argues, no, Rabbi Yonah is in the Yerushalmi. Although Rabbi Yossi argues, the conclusion of the Yerushalmi appears to reject his argument. Ma'olitain tavlin milmata. What if you take uncooked spice on the bottom? Ula arasalen milman. Pour hot liquid from a Kli Rishon on top of the spice. Rav Yonah Amar Aser. The Iri Kli Rishon. Pouring from a Kli Rishon is like immersing the food directly into the Kli Rishon. Chayled Rav Yonah min Hadah. Supporting Rav Yonah's opinion is a Mishnah. Echad shebishal bo, echad she'ira l'sochol roseach. Whether you cooked it inside of the dish, whether you poured it on top of the dish, it's cooking. Rav Yossi tamon kli cheres boleya. A earthenware kli will absorb the flavor, the taste of hot food poured into it. But tavlin einan misbashlin. But if you have uncooked spices and you pour hot liquid from a kli rishon onto it doesn't cook it. Hisiv Rabbi Yossi beRav Bun. Rabbi Yossi argued, V'hatani af b'kli nechoshes kain, means what's the difference whether the spice is in an earthenware or in a copper dish? Can you say a copper vessel absorbs? No, copper vessels are not absorbent. Ramban explains the continuation of the Tzurba as qualifying that the entire prohibition discusses only rabbinic, in line with his view that even cooking a rishon is only rabbinically prohibited. So it seems that according to the conclusion of the Yerushalmi, pouring from a kli rishon over uncooked food is prohibited on Shabbos. However, this conclusion is not necessarily accepted as halacha. Tosfos, citing the position of the Rashbam, that pouring hot liquid from a kli rishon over food is only equivalent to placing the food in a hot kli sheni. This is due to a principle from the conclusion of the Gemara Pesachim 76a, that when a hot item is placed on top of a cold item, or vice versa, tato gavar, that's a principle that the lower item prevails and will cool or heat the hot item, meaning if the lower item is hot, it will prevail and it will transfer the flavor to the upper food. If the lower item is cool, so it will cool everything off. Similarly, the kli sheni will prevail over the hot liquid poured into it from the kli rishon, cooling it, preventing it from cooking. Rabbeinu Shmuel Mevi, Raya, the irki kli sheni, mehadekaimelon tato gavar. Just like this principle of depending which food is lower than the other food, the lower food controls. So similarly, Tosfos is saying is a kli sheni, which is cold. You have an empty bowl, it's cold. Now you pour hot food in it, the bottom is going to cool, it dominates, and it's going to cool what's above. Tosfos quotes the Ri, who argues that pouring from a kli rishon is equivalent to immersing in a kli rishon, and he brings the same proof, but Rabbeinu Yonah in the Yerushalmi, Ularin Nira, the Iru kli rishon. Iru is not like a kli sheni, but it's like a kli rishon. Umevi Raya, the Bezvochim Perek Dam Chatas, Ton Rabbanan, Asher Tevushal Bo, Ainli Ala Shabishal Bo, that's cooking directly in the dish. Ira L'Socho Rosef, what if you poured something hot? Minayin, that it's also cooking. Talmud Loimar, Asher Tevushal Bo Yishaver, Alma de Iru Chashem Avushal. So the Ri says that pouring hot liquid from a kli rishon will cook. The Ri continues by bringing another proof to his position from the Yerushalmi quoted above. Tosfos concludes that pouring from a kli rishon is capable of cooking only the top layer of food with which it comes in contact. Nira, the iri lo avka kli rishon, lo kli sheni. It's not like a kli rishon, it's not like a kli sheni. Kli rishon cooks completely. Kli sheni, we said, doesn't cook at all. El mavashel kedei klipa. Wherever you pour the hot liquid on, whatever layer, the 1 millimeter layer of food, it cooks that. Because of this concept that the lower food substance prevails. It has the ability to cook just kedei klipa. The Omer Hasam Tanik of Shmuel, that cham l'toch tzonin, if you pour something hot into cold, adimiakar lebola, it'll absorb a little bit while it's cooling, that if that you have to peel off the outer layer if hot food fell onto cold food. So just have to, the bottom cool food, the bottom cold food, that just the kedei klipa, just a 1 millimeter layer got cooked. So you have to peel it off and then you can eat the rest of it. So this all also has to do with kashrus. Something hot, non-kosher, is poured on something cold, kosher, so it'll absorb only kedei klipa, because tato gavor. The bottom, since the bottom, now if the bottom was hot, the bottom would transfer its taste completely to a cold food that's on top of it, and it would usher the whole cold food. But if you pour something or place something on hot on top of something cold, you'd have to peel off a kedei klipa, but it doesn't ruin the whole food. That's by kashrus. So as far as Shabbos is concerned, you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. Whether it cooks the entire food or just a klipa, the isser is to do bishul. So if it can be mavashal, the kedei klipa, you've clearly violated Shabbos. Right? And therefore the Shulchan Aruch rules accordingly. Asr litain tavlin b'ka'ara. You can't put uncooked, cold spices in a dish. And take liquid that was in a kli rishon, which was hot liquid on the fire. Even though you've taken the kli off the fire, if you pour from that kli directly, that's called irui kli rishon, pouring from a kli rishon. That has the ability to cook the spices that are in the dish. The Mishnah explains that this ruling follows the conclusion of Tosfos, that pouring from a kli rishon cooks the outermost layer of the food. The after the name is bashna b'kli sheni. All the spices don't get cooked in a kli sheni. Mikol makom ha'irui mikli rishon, the pouring from the kli rishon. Kai melanda umavashal kedei klipa. It cooks the thin layer of the spice, and that's enough. Often, one wants to pour hot water from a kettle into a cup that has a few drops of water in it. Based on the ruling above, the Shmir Shabbos Kilchosa writes that you should first dry the cup to avoid cooking those cool drops. So if you're going to pour into a kli, you got to make sure that the kli is dry. Al alei te shelo nizbashu. Agabe eish mibod yom. You should not pour hot water from a kli rishon on tea leaves that have not been cooked. Tamsis is like essence. Take kara afimaisa mevushelas. Now, let's say they called it scents, right? They had cooked tea and then they allowed it to cool down, but it's very concentrated. And now you want to make tea with that. So if it's been completely cooled down and you pour something hot on it, it's going to cook it. Even pouring hot water into a cup, but it has a few drops of liquid in it, you are going to be cooking those liquid drops. So you got to make sure it's dry. This is also the position of Moshe Feinstein. If the drops were not previously heated, he explains that although one does not care about heating the drops of water, and they are also smaller than the minimum amount for which one would be liable to bring a korban for having cooked on Shabbos, this is nevertheless prohibited. Rav Moshe is lenient when pouring hot water on leftover drops of tea or water that had been hot previously and then cooled down. In this case, he writes that we can combine the fact that one is reheating liquid, which is more lenient, with the fact that one does not care about or benefit from those drops that are in there. It's going to one drop in 8 ounces, it's you don't really care about it. Now, Harav Vosner, the Shevet HaLevi, writes that one must empty the cup only from a significant amount of water, but one need not dry insignificant drops. He explains that as there is no benefit in heating these drops, it's not considered bishul. Asher sha'al l'mais, somebody asked, I am tzarich liyavish hakos l'fnei shofchem bo mayim chaim. Do you have to dry a cup completely before you pour hot water in it? Darche lahakel. The practice is to be lenient. You just have to sort of take your cup and like hit it on your hand so that it gets rid of any real liquid in there. The few drops that left behind, we don't have to be worried about that. Not really adding significant volume to your tea there. The principle of chatzi shir is whatever you're not allowed to do. Let's say you can't eat a piece of chazer. Well, you get malchus if you eat a kazayas, but that doesn't allow you to eat a half a kazayas of chazer. Chatzi shir is also minator. You can't eat any of that chazer, whether you get malchus or not. So he's saying, well, what about, why isn't a few drops considered chatzi shir? He says it's less than chatzi shir. The chatzi shir shayachem kol gidrei bishul, and the chaser shir chiyuv. All the elements of bishul are there. You just don't have enough in order to get malchus. Mashen ken nitzotzim kol shehem. There's a few drops. Ela de lo shayachem gidrei bishul klal. There's no bishul at all. V'gam bevadai hu psik reish lo lechem like klal. It's something that happens without kavanah. He doesn't really care about it. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, the former chief rabbi, agrees that one need not be concerned about heating insignificant drops, and adds that drying the cup completely should be avoided. This may lead to squeezing out the cloth used. So you see what goes on here. No matter what you do, someone finds problem with it. Do you have to dry up a cup from the drops of water that are in it? Before you pour hot water from a kli rishon. We just shake the drops of water out. Because even if some water is going to be left, there's no problem. We don't care. Better not to dry it. Because Shama Yischot, you're going to come to squeeze it out. That's an Isser Deraisa. The Tzitz Eliezer says that you don't have to shake the drops out. So Klisheni and the appearance of cooking. We have seen so far that in principle, it is usually a custom that a Klisheni does not do bishul, except we said if you had a solid item in the Klisheni and you put something on top of that solid item, and the solid item is Yad Soledispo, so that will cook because you don't have the solid item stands its ground. It's basically not in contact with the walls of the Klisheni to cool it down. In this section, the next, we will see that there are other instances as well when a Klisheni may be subject to bishul. The Mishnah Masechta Shabbos quoted in the previous shir teaches us the principle that there's no further bishul after the initial cooking of food. In Hebrew, we say ein bishul achar bishul. Continues with the leniency regarding food that has not yet been cooked. Rinsing even uncooked food in hot water is permitted, with some exceptions. Says the Mishnah Masechta Shabbos, Kol sheba b'chamim erev Shabbos, something that was in hot water already on erev Shabbos. Shoyrin oisoy b'chamim b'Shabbos. You can soak it in hot water on Shabbos. Kol shelo ba b'chamim erev Shabbos, if it had not been placed in hot water before Shabbos. Madichin oso b'chamim. You can't place it in a dish with hot water, but you can rinse it with hot water. Chutz man hameliach hayashon. Let's say you have salted fish, v'dagi meluchim ketanim, v'kul yisai spanim, shihadachtan zui gmar melachtan. Rinsing it with hot water sort of completes the processing of those fish. So that has a different malacha. That's called makeh b'patish, which, if you sort of finish the production of a kli, so here as well, it's not going to be bishul, it's going to be makeh b'patish. The rinsing in hot water permitted by the Mishnah appears to be synonymous with pouring hot water over food. The Mishnah also does not stipulate any limitation on the vessel used to pour. It appears to permit even using hot water from a kli rishon. However, Tosfos writes that those who maintain that this is prohibited must explain that the leniency in the Mishnah indeed only applies to pouring from a kli sheni, not from a kli rishon. This limited leniency would seemingly imply that immersing the food in hot water is prohibited even in a kli sheni. Right? It's only pouring from a kli sheni that'll be permitted. But it seems to imply that immersing some food in a kli sheni is prohibited, but that seems to be against what we assumed up till now, that a kli sheni doesn't have the ability to do bishul. So it says Tosfos there in Shabbos Lamed Tes. Leperush Rashbam, the way the Rashbam explains, the Mafarish, the Iru kli sheni, that irui, pouring from a kli rishon, is kli sheni, is the same as a kli sheni which is permitted. Asi shaper hacha, the ein sharnos of a kli rishon. That makes sense. We can't soak something in a kli rishon. Aval madichnos of a kli rishon, but you could rinse from it. Derech irui. That's the way the Rashbam explains. Aval persha benu tam. The mafarish the iri havik kli rishon. That pouring from a kli rishon is like a kli rishon. It has to be that you can't immerse in a kli sheni either. It means you got to pour from a kli sheni. Well, you should. It shouldn't. The Mishnah shouldn't just said, "Oh, you're allowed to rinse from a kli sheni." It should have said you're allowed to soak in a kli sheni, but it didn't say that. Says Rabbeinu Tam. So Tosfos offered two resolutions. You're not allowed to take uncooked food and soak it in a kli sheni that has hot water in it. We have a new concept. It's like a marasayan. It looks like bishul. Avagav the tan lekaman. Daf membez aval noisen l'socha ka'ara, that you may place spices into a bowl or into a dish. That's spices that's meant to flavor the dish. It's not like it looks like it's cooking them. Or inami, another answer is huadin shoyrinoso, that not only can you pour from a kli sheni, you can soak in a kli sheni. Because even the Irish a kli sheni. The reason why the Mishnah said madichin only and not shoyrin lashminin, that you don't have to take these salted fishes and soak it in a hot water to finish its work. Even pouring will finish its work. But regarding bishul, it doesn't. You could soak. So according to the first answer of Tosfos, uncooked food may not be placed in a kli sheni, despite the fact that it will not cook, because it's like a gzeira. It has the appearance of cooking. So it's not me'ikar adin. It's not that we're over bishul. We're over a rabbinic harchaka, a gzeira. The leniency of a kli sheni only applies to spices, where this concern of it looks like cooking does not exist. That's the first answer of Tosfos. But according to the second answer, most uncooked food may be placed in a kli sheni. But those foods that cook very easily may not even be rinsed from a kli sheni. That's called kalei bishul, things that are easily cooked. The Mogen Avraham rules stringently. He rules in accordance with the first answer of Tosfos and adds that onion is also equivalent to spices in this regard. You cannot soak spices in a klisheni that has hot water in it. It looks like bishul. Excuse me, food. You can't put food in a klisheni. V'lo dami l'tavlin. It's not like spices. The tavlin also l'mate kayater v'lo mesakim avashal. You're adding spices to make the dish more flavorful, and you're not. The intent is not to cook those. Veneerly the botzel dino ketavlin david l'taimei. Adding onion is not a problem because it's also done for flavor. This is also the ruling of the Mishnah Berurah and Rav Yitzchak Rubin and Rav Shalom Gelber, authors of the Sefer Orchos Shabbos. Both omit the extension of the leniency to onion, likely because, as we will see shortly, adding onion to a klisheni may be prohibited due to the concern of it being considered kalei abishul. There's types of food that are easily cooked. Says the Orchos Shabbos, Ein litin Michael bilti mevushal b'klisheni sheyat soleves bo. If you have a klisheni that has hot liquid in it or hot food in it, and the temperature of the food is yad soleves bo, you can't add food substances that are not cooked to that. Because the av sheklisheni and a mavashal matorah, we've already learned extensively that a klisheni doesn't have the ability to cook from the Torah. Mikol makom echmiru chachamim shelo litein bo davar meichel she'ena mevushal mishum denira kemavashal. It's marasayan. The chachamim are stringent not to put something that hasn't been cooked, a food item that hasn't been cooked, into this klisheni. It looks like you're cooking. However, if you're putting things in there, not to cook the food, but it improves the food already in the klisheni. You can put it in there. If you have hot food in a klisheni, you can add spices to it. It's not considered that you've cooked the spices. If you add cold lemon juice to a hot tea, you don't have to be worried that it looks like you're cooking the lemon. It's clear that it's coming to give taste in your drink and not to cook the lemon. On the other hand, the Eglei Tal writes that even since, according to the first answer of Tosfos, the prohibition is merely rabbinic, we may rely on the second answer and another Rishonim who permit adding food to a klisheni without concern for an appearance of bishul. You want to soak uncooked food in a klisheni that has hot liquid in it, you can do it. Kiven Dildas, Harabenu Eliezer Mimitz, who was a Rishon, that's Metz, Va'meiri V'atur, who learned Masnisin de Madichin B'Kli Rishon, who understood the Tosfos that you could rinse with a Kli Rishon. V'hat Tani Avalo Shorin, Aval Klisheni Mutter, but you're allowed to soak in a Klisheni. Loshita said Tosfos never told B'Shnei Atirutzim. Tosfos leniency is related to both of these answers. And v'chol ha'isru d'Rabbanan. The whole prohibition is rabbinic. Pshita de naktin and la'akel. So the Eglei Tal says we can be lenient. Mogen Avraham, lefi shelo ra divrei Rabbeinu Eliezer mimitz, he never saw Rabbeinu Eliezer. The appears was in Kli Rishon. The Sover shel divrei Kol Masis b'Kli Sheni Mayri al Ken Ichmir. He was machmir because he had not seen the leniency of Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz. He says there's no question you can be lenient. Rav Yosef, Vadia Yosef Kotzei Egleital, concurs with the lenient ruling. However, as we shall see in the next section, there may still be an additional problem with respect to klisheni, even when the concern of having the appearance of cooking does not apply. We learned in the previous subsection that Rishonim and Achronim dispute whether cooking in a klisheni may constitute a problem of having the appearance of bishul in many cases. There may be an additional concern as well when cooking in a klisheni, based upon the fact that some foods become cooked very easily, even a klisheni. To better understand this issue, we must review again the Mishnah quoted in source 27. As we saw, the Mishnah lists some exceptions to the leniency of rinsing uncooked food in hot water. According to the Mishnah, certain types of fish, we said like salted fish, may not be rinsed in hot water because this rinsing is sufficient to complete their malacha. Rashi explained the malacha referred to as cooking, since these fish cook easily, even by mere rinsing. Says Rashi, except from the salted fish, dag maliach shel shana shavar, last year's, it's an old fish, the kuyusai spanin, shem dag, people eat it because it's salty, but first, they rinse it in hot. We wouldn't be allowed to rinse these. Foods such as these fish, which cook more easily than regular food, are referred to in some sources as kalei abishul, easy to cook food. And the halacha is codified by the Shulchan Aruch. Imu davar yavesh, you're talking about something dry. Shlon izbashem lifnei Shabbos, was not cooked before Shabbos. Ein shorna so b'chamin b'Shabbos, you can't soak them in hot water on Shabbos. Aval madichin so b'chamin b'Shabbos, you can rinse it. Chutz min ha'miliach hayoshon, except for the salted fish, u'min hadag shenikra kulyas aspanin, some kind of Spanish kulyas. She'enan sheichim bushel ma'at, they only need a little cooking. V'hadachta nikmar melachta. The Gemara proves from the language of the Mishnah that rinsing these types of fish in hot water constitutes a biblically prohibited malacha. One who inadvertently performs this action on Shabbos must bring a chatas. Kol shelo ba b'cham, and if something wasn't cooked in hot water before Shabbos, a hidiach mai. Now, why? What's going on? If he did rinse and he didn't know what he's doing, Amar Rav Yosef, hidiach chayv chatas. If he did it unknowingly, he has to bring a chatas. Omer Marbrei Ravina, Afanana mitanina. We learn the same thing. Chutz v'meliach yoshan u'kol yisai spanin she'dachtan zuig mar malachtan shmamina. Now, is the Mishnah statement regarding liability for rinsing these fish in hot water referring to a kli rishon being poured over it, or kli sheni? We saw above in source 28 that according to Tosfos, the leniency of the Mishnah concerning applies only to rinsing with hot water from a kli sheni. As this leniency does not apply to the types of fish described, it follows that even rinsing these fish with hot water from a kli sheni, and certainly placing them directly in a kli sheni, is prohibited on a biblical level. We saw the Egleital's comment in source 32 that the position of Tosfos is not unanimous. The Sefer Yereim and others understand that the Mishnah permits rinsing even from a kli rishon, which would mean that they understand the Mishnah's strict ruling for the particular fish mentioned applying to a kli rishon. Nevertheless, the Sefer Yereim also agrees that some food items are subject to bishul, even a kli sheni. What is, to better understand the Sefer Yereim's argument concerning bishul and kli sheni, let us examine the discussion in the Gemara and the Poskim concerning cooking salt and spices on Shabbos. As we have seen above, adding spices to a kli rishon is prohibited on Shabbos, whereas adding them to a kli rishon is permitted. The Gemara in Shabbos states that Rav Yosef initially thought that uncooked salt is similar to spices in this regard. But Abaye cites a brayso taught by Rav Chia, which states that salt has a different halacha than spices in this regard. though two possible versions of this difference exist. Either salt may not be added even to a kli sheni, or salt may be added even to a kli rishon. That means they go even from the most stringent, which is it can't be added into a kli sheni, or you can go the most lenient, where you could have it added even to a kli rishon. So Rav Yosef L'meimar. Rav Yosef wanted to say, Melech hariyu ketavlit. Salt is like spice. The b'kli rishon b'sheila, that it cooks in a kli rishon. B'kli sheni lo b'sheila. Arblei abayatani Rab Chia. Melech ene ketavlit. Salt is not like spice. The b'kli sheni nami b'sheila. Right? That's the stringent version. That salt can be cooked in a kli sheni. But pligid Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, tzricha milcha bishula kibasar de Torah. Salt needs a lot of cooking, and therefore, even putting in a kli rishon wouldn't be a problem. That spice, salt is like spices that they can be cooked in a kli rishon, not a kli sheni. Armelei Abaya, Tani Rav Chia, melach einan ketavlit. It's not like salt. Salt is not like spices. The kli rishon nami lo b'sheila. But Rav Nachman tzricha milcha bishula k'bisr de Torah, that it needs a lot of cooking. According to the Gemara, Rav Nachman holds that one may be lenient about salt even at kli rishon. That matches the second version of the Brisa quoted by Rav Chia. Most of the Rishonim, the Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh, rule in accordance with this approach, that salt may be added even to a kli rishon, and the Shulchan Aruch rules accordingly. That means even when you take the kli rishon off the fire, you can add salt to it. Melach mutter lite l'socho. You can put salt into a kli. Kivin shavir malish, once you took it off the fire. And it's not considered a problem. The tzricha milcha bishul kibisatoy needs long type of cooking. Tosfos add that one who acts stringently, refraining from adding uncooked coarse salt, as opposed to table salt, even to a kli sheni, will be blessed. Table salt, sold commercially today, has already undergone either cooking or drying. If the salt has already been cooked, there is certainly no reason to avoid adding it even to a kli rishon. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says, Mishras Kolchasa says.
Because we learned last week, that's the question that I asked you. So obviously we can use table salt for anything that we want.
If the table salt, as it says here, has been cooked.
Well, all table salt is cooked. I mean, it's not. That's how it gets to be table salt.
Or dried. He says if the salt has already been cooked, you can add it. If it has merely been dried, so that's equivalent to baking, that status is less clear. This baking process may not be equivalent to cooking, and may even render the salt kale abishu, and which may not be evident to kli sheni. Some poskim say that for this reason, one should be strict about putting salt in a kli sheni, though placing in a kli sheni is less problematic. Coarse salt, which is generally uncooked, is subject to the machlokas that we're going to have it in the text here. The Shulchan Aruch said you can put salt. Tosfos, though, said if someone refrains from doing it, he should get a blessing. And the Ramah quotes this. Yesh oisrim loses melech afil b'kli sheni. Chosman shayet soles. But we're talking about when the soup is 114 degrees in the kli sheni. If it's less, then that's not a problem, because less than yad soles is not going to cook. V'amachmir tov v'lov brach. So we have to see. You have to check. What does it say about the salt?
Some people use like sea salt or Himalayan,
What about Morton salt? What does it
I
say?
think that's regular
Is it
salt.
cooked? Does it say it's cooked? Is that called Morton's? Let us now return to the question of bishul and kli sheni generally. Based on the Gemara regarding salt, Rabbi Eliezer of Metz writes that there's no blanket rule that a Kli Rishon cooks and a Kli Sheni does not. There are other factors, the foods that you're putting in there. Right? Because foods, other than examples of the Mishnah, can also sometimes be cooked, even a Kli Sheni. Now, this is important. He concludes that since we do not know exactly which items are in this category, which are in the Kalei Abishul or not, when in doubt, we must refrain from placing any uncooked food in a Kli Sheni or even a Kli Shlishi. Says the Yereim, Ein Bishul Toli Lo B'Kli Rishon Lo B'Kli Sheni. We've seen that whether something cooks or not, it's not dependent on whether the thing is a Kli Rishon or not. Ach lefi shu davar mizbashal pamim shu davar rach. You might be dealing with a food stuff that is very soft, easily cooked. Mizbashal apa Kli Sheni will be rendered cooked, even a Kli Sheni. Yesh davar kosher for Kli Rishon and mizbashal. There's something very hard that even if in the Kli Rishon it won't cook. V'yesh davar mizbashal b'Kli Rishon v'lo b'Kli Sheni. Some things will only cook in a Kli Rishon, but not a Kli Sheni. Melach eino ketavlin. Like we said in Masechta Shabbos, salt is not like tavlin. De b'Kli Sheni nami b'sheila, because it can be cooked in a Kli Sheni. Hilkach, says the Sefer Yereim, Yizar adam sholachnis b'Shabbos shum davar b'Kli Sheni v'ap'Kli Shlishi sheyatzo le'espo. If you're dealing with very hot food, the food is 114 degrees. And we don't care, says the Yereim, whether it's in a Kli Sheni or a Kli Shlishi even. If it's Yad Soledesbo, don't add anything to it. Shein anu b'kim b'dvarim rakim b'kashim. We are not expert in this. Miu mizbashal b'Kli Sheni, miu sheni mizbashal. So accordingly, there are more rules that one may not soak any hard food item in hot water if this process renders it fit to eat. Hu adin kol davar kosher shein roy le'echel klal lo shriya. You have some food stuff that's hard, and you can't eat it unless it soaks in hot water. Also, l'sharosa b'Shabbos, davi gemar melacha. You can't soak it on Shabbos. That's how it's going to be completed. And the Mishnah Brura clarifies that this applies even to soaking the food in a Kli Sheni. The Asr l'sharosa, it'll be Kli Sheni. Elsewhere, the Mishnah Berurah points out that according to Rav Eliezer of Metz, we must refrain from placing any uncooked food in a Kli Sheni, with the exception of certain foods, which the Gemara explicitly permits adding to a Kli Sheni, namely water, oil, and spices. Those spices today may not be included. Some poskim rule that spices may be placed in the Kli Sheni. However, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes that today spices are ground so finely that they can be cooked even in a Kli Sheni, similar to other cases of Kalei Abishul. Since the Ramah writes that it is customary to be strict concerning the status of a Kli Sheni and follow the approach of the Sefer Yereim, many contemporary Ashkenazi poskim accept the Yereim's strict approach to include most foods as Kalei Abishul. The Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa spells this out. Mikevan sheyeshna machal mizbashim gam b'Kli Sheni. Because there exist foods that can cook even at Kli Sheni. Vein anachnu b'kim ladas eluim. We are not expert to know what kinds of things can be cooked in a Kli Sheni. Yesh lahachmir, the lomar. We have to be stringent to say shekol davar she'eino mevushal, anything that's not cooked. Yesh misum misher bishul gam b'nesinaso b'Kli Sheni, even if you put it in a Kli Sheni. Imam nami is bashel sheb'Kli Sheni hu cham b'shir sheyat soledespo. As long as the food that you're putting it in is the temperature of Yad Soledespo. The Chazon Ish argues that one need not assume that most foods are Kalei Abishul. We need only be stringent regarding foods such as bread, which has already been baked. Bread is mentioned as an example of Kalei Abishul by Rav Eliezer Mintz. He establishes that all solid foods already been cooked cannot be cooked further. Food that has been roasted or baked can subsequently be cooked, and vice versa. The Rav Yah disagrees. The Shulchan Aruch quotes both views, while the Ramah writes that our opinion is to be stringent, l'chadchila. So bread can be cooked, and eggs, which we know cook easily. Says the Chazon Ish. Kazav Mishnah Berurah, Sivkot Mem Beis, B'Shem Mogen Avram, D'yesh la'achmer v'chol davar she'ein heter mavur b'Gemara. We should be stringent unless the Gemara gave us a heter. You yeshlomer kiven demayim v'shemen muvar b'Gemara she'ein misbasha b'kli sheni. The Gemara stated explicitly that water and oil do not cook in a kli sheni, so ein la'achmir. So you can add water and oil, but we should be machmir rak b'pas, adding bread. Amavur b'smag, mishum shu kvar ofui. Baking it, the fact that it was baked, it's no achlis bashal, makes it easier to cook. Avalo b'shar dover. You don't have to be stringent with other items, says the Chazon Ish. Bread. Omnam levashel beit sabik lisheni sheyatzos bevadei oser. You cannot add a raw egg to a klisheni that's yatso lettuce on Shabbos because it's going to cook it. The kiva the Chazon Ish is bashels b'klisheni, we see with our own eyes that a raw egg will be cooked if you put it in a klisheni, which is a yad soletis bowl, so you can't put it in there, just like a kli rishon. Even the Torah who is lenient, here he'll agree that you can cook in a klisheni. Similarly, some Sephardic poskim maintain one need not be strict about bishul and a klisheni for most foods, except for those which appear to be kalei bishul, since the Shulchan Aruch didn't mention this stringency. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu does not agree with this approach. He maintains similar to the approach of Ben Ashkenazi poskim, that we must treat all foods as potentially kalei bishul. But the lenient approach was the opinion of Rav Avadia Yosef. Chazon Avadia, Yeshoimrim, Shava Bishomer Chazal, Klisheni and a Mavashel. Chazal have told us that a Klisheni doesn't have the power to cook. Ikomakam Yesh Dvarim, Rakim Shemiz Bashel B'Klisheni. There are soft items that will cook in a Klisheni Sheyad Solenspo. Veinano Bekim Beid Rakim L'Kashim. We're not expert. What's soft, what's hard, what can cook. However, yesh chokin v'oimrim shein hevdel b'zeh bein kashim l'rakim. Shekula min inspashim b'klisheni. He's quoting the lenient opinions that a klisheni cannot cook no matter what. V'alocha koloshen achron. Vavadia is lenient. He says we follow the last loshen. U'mi Ashkenazim noagim l'achmer kedei harishon. Okay. I'm going to stop here. We've discussed extensively klisheni. And we're going to deal with klishlishi, whether they're chumrus with that, and all the practical applications. How do you make tea, and et cetera, et cetera. So this will be continued next week. Any questions, comments, Harold?
Complicated sugya.
That's why you should just like do it in smaller chunks.
Yeah, well, we did Kli Rishon last week. Now we did Kli Sheni. We understand. I think we've gotten a better understanding. Kli Rishon can cook. Kli Sheni in general cannot cook. But we've learned there's stringencies about a Kli Sheni. Bread, things, eggs, things that are soft. And now we've learned that there's chumras about just marasayan. But we see the Ashkenazim are much more stringent. The Sephardic poskim are much more lenient, following Rav Avadia. Okay,